This is TWiT.
We have a great guest. He's actually been on the show before. Richard Gingras is here. Last time when Richard was on, he was vice president of news at Google. He is no longer in that position. He has moved on. Richard, well,
he's emeritus now.
Emeritus, just moved on. Welcome. It's great to have you, Richard.
It's good to be here. In fact, I am consuming a bit of artificial intelligence while we speak.
Is that computronium you have in there?
It looks like more like cider than beer, but
Richard is a specialist at cocktails, you should know.
A good bourbon. Oh, now we're talking. All right. So far, so good. We're half the panel's drunk, and the rest of us are catching up.
Old.
So, Jeff, why don't you introduce Richard and tell us a little bit about him? Because I know you know him well.
So, last time Richard and I were on the same flight, the flight attendant came up and said, "Oh, you're brothers."
Okay, I wasn't going to say it because I thought it sounded offensive just because you're both white men with glasses, white hair, and beards, but I've been thinking it the entire time, especially because you guys are right next to each other on my Zoom screen, and I'm like, it's like looking in a strange mirror.
It is. So we are brothers of a different mother and father. Richard has been around our industry for a long time, headed up Salon.
Loved Salon, by the way. Still love Salon. Yeah.
On early internet access service called, which one was it, Richard? Not Excite.
Oh God! I mean, Excite. Before
Excite.
that, eWorld.
eWorld.
Yeah.
Apple's very interesting kind of. It's almost skeuomorphic village-based internet service. I liked eWorld actually.
That's right.
And then for the last how many years, Richard?
E-guy.
At Google?
You're the E-guy.
About 15.
So 15 years at Google as vice president of news.
Wow.
And has had all kinds of things there. And has been a really great friend of journalism and news. Starting the Google News Initiative, starting all kinds of other...
Well, the Trust Project, really.
The Trust Project outside of Google as well.
Still involved in some of this, yes?
And Google Newsgeist, which is when we journalism walks get together to complain about the state of the world and try to fix it, and all kinds of things. And so I'm delighted that Richard's here, and now that he's no longer officially an employee of Google, he's unleashed, and so we can talk about anything. No comms there, breathing.
Wait,
down
yeah.
his neck.
When was your last day? Was this a recent departure?
My last day officially was last Friday.
Wow.
So you're fresh off the Google boat. How does it feel?
Fresh. It feels absolutely fine. I miss my admin.
That's a very googly response.
In some ways, you're leaving at kind of a critical juncture because news is now faced, I think, with even more existential threats than ever, thanks to AI and AI slop. And yet it's more important. We need news. We need reliable, authoritative news more than ever.
Authoritarian, you were going to say.
Well, we have authoritarian. We need more authoritative news than ever. What is your prognosis for the future of news?
I mean, I think we can have a very good future of news, but I think it really requires all of us in the profession to really step back, which the profession has been kind of reluctant to do over the years, and really kind of assess the situation and see what we can do to work ourselves forward. And I think there's a lot we can and should do, whether that's with regard to re-earning trust, or understanding how best we evolve what news can be in this different digital environment, figuring out savvy business models that don't rely on philanthropy, figuring out smart uses of AI, and there are many smart uses of AI. So I have great reasons for optimism, but we have to take those steps forward. And by the way, I'm no longer at Google, but I'm very actively involved in several endeavors that are very much targeted on exactly what I'm talking about.
Can you tell us about those?
Yes, two. One is an effort which Jeff is aware of. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, I, with a few others, put together a global research institute that I think, likes to think of itself as a think tank for the role of journalism in society, the role of the free press and the open internet in society. And it looks at everything from public policy questions around the world, which are very challenging as governments recognize the impact of the internet and want to control it, to how do we think through matters of trust in AI and business models. So that's one area. Marty Barron's on the board, Maria Ressa, headed by the executive director is Amy Mitchell, who for 2 decades headed research at Pew. So great people trying to help people with more additional thinking and research on those questions. And then the second, which I'm very excited about, is in the area of local news, where I've been there too, working hard to figure out how do we rethink what local news can be in a community. And a singular company that I've identified in my work around the world is a company out of Canada called Village Media, which is doing that extraordinarily well, rethinking every component. How do we strengthen the communities? How do we drive their engagement? And does so commercially, sustainably, entirely with local advertising. And so I've become chairman of the board of Village Media, and we'll work with them to expand that model. And there too, great reasons to be hopeful, but it does require stepping back and saying, let's kind of take this down to the studs and rebuild it with new thinking appropriate to our time and place.
Is there a trust crisis? Because I think those of us who consume news increasingly, even with the Journal of Record, I know Jeff is less than happy with the New York Times, feel like maybe we can't trust what we're reading, that there's an angle, or, we have a wonderful, speaking of local newspapers, local newspaper in town that was family run for years has now been purchased by a private equity firm. And immediately my reaction is, well, I guess I can't trust it anymore.
Yes, we do have a huge trust issue with news, and not surprisingly, nor is it new for that matter. You're right. I mean, if you kind of look at the history of how things evolved, one of the key, I think, things that we miss in understanding the challenge of our current world is to simply recognize that, with the increased propagation of the ability for people to communicate with each other, to express themselves, the expansion of the marketplace for publishing and information, it becomes more difficult, it becomes more fragmented, becomes more polarized. It didn't start with the internet. I mean, in truth, as Jeff knows, it started with Gutenberg. But if you look at, electronic communications, look what happened with television and cable in the United States, and you started to see more partisan news outlets, right? So, why would we even wonder whether there's a trust issue in news? In fact, my core concern about it is often people say when they hear that, you'll hear journalists say, well, we need more media literacy to tell people that they can trust journalism. And I go, but that's absurd. Journalism isn't monolithic. There are great sources, there are bad sources. So how do they identify them? And how do the sources themselves, how do news institutions, again, rethink our approach to re-earn that trust? I think there's a tremendous amount of arrogance in journalism. There's a tremendous amount of assumption that we know the answers when the answers aren't necessarily knowable. And frankly, the audiences are smart enough to call us on that. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, and we have to stop pointing fingers at others as solutions to our problems.
The days of Edward R. Murrow and the Tiffany Network, news was seen as a prestige product. And the fact that news lost money was not a cause for concern. CBS made plenty of money in other places. I mean, Jack Benny or whatever it was, Milton Berle. But I think more and more we're in an environment where people like Jeff Bezos are coming in to rescue the Washington Post. It looks like news is not, because it's not fundamentally profitable. Warner Brothers is spinning off CNN because they see it as a sinking ship. Same with MSNBC. I think the crisis is news is no longer a prestige product, and nobody is willing to fund it.
I would push back a little bit on that. I think that the problem isn't that news is fundamentally unprofitable and no one wants to fund it. I think it's just that mass market advertising supported media that's target audience is everyone that has a cell phone is a fundamentally flawed concept.
Yeah, we're going to get Henry Blodgett on, I think, in future weeks. I'll ask him about that. Yeah, well, that's a good question. Is news profitable? Can news be profitable? Should it be profitable?
It certainly can be profitable, and people are proving that. I mean, I think one of the dynamics here that's wrong, I mean, Village Media, the company I mentioned, is profitable in every one of its markets. Obviously the New York Times is profitable. So it's not by any means impossible for there to be commercially successful sources. I think one of the problems we have in this space is, given the disruption, you have both the legacy players on one side who have been, frankly, almost irresponsibly incapable of innovating in this period. And particularly now, they're owned by hedge funds. They don't have any particular interest in the news business outside of harvesting the assets. And then on the emerging side, sadly, you have a lot of folks who are trying to do the right noble thing, but they've been led to believe there is no commercial future. They've led to believe that philanthropy will save their bacon, as it were, and allow them to continue to do news that they always did and be successful. And that's incorrect. But again, it's not. We have to kind of stop with that notion that it can't be successful and start going deep with, quite frankly, rigorous business tactics to say, well, where's the opportunity in the market? What's the right business model that'll fit what I'm trying to do?
Go back to Leo's question about AI. He asked the challenge of determining authority from slop. So hit both sides of that coin of where the potential risks are with AI, but where the potential uses and benefits are.
I personally think there's just tremendous opportunity in AI for us as individuals, and I think for news organizations. Is there risk? Of course there is. As there has been with any media environment. I think with AI, it's going to come down to questions like, well, what source of AI knowledge are you going to? Because there'll be many, because there are many. Now here too, and one interesting dynamic, I was going to mention this back to when you were talking about the Tiffany networks. One of the interesting things back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when you didn't have the proliferation of cable outlets, was these news organizations had to recognize that they couldn't just address a certain cohort of the audience. They were addressing everyone because they had huge audiences. They didn't want to piss off one segment of the audience. And so they had a greater inclination to try to be impartial, which frankly helps lead to trust and respect across the spectrum, right? I think in a similar fashion now, when I look at AI, I'm much more inclined to trust the larger entities, including the Googles, because frankly, they've got an audience of billions of people, and they need the trust of all those people. They need to do it well. What I am concerned about is obviously the models coming out of nowhere, coming out of dark states that clearly can be misused to do harm and will.
Tools for journalists. I mean, when we go back, I'm finishing my Lanotype book right now, and technology first affected the composing room, and it was seen by the publishers only as a way to cut costs, and that's very familiar for today. They're using it to cut costs. They're using it without innovation. What are some of the most innovative things you've seen news organizations do? What should they be doing? What could they be doing that they're not now? Or that they are now? Somebody's doing good work with
yeah. Well, first of all, I think we need to be comfortable with the language that we use. And I think any publisher who goes to his newsroom and starts talking about efficiencies is not going to get the desired result. Right? That sounds like cost cutting. When I talk to newsrooms about it, I talk about, are you taking advantage of the superpowers that you can have by leveraging these capabilities? Right. In fact, Gina Chua at Semaphore told me that she once was confronted by her newsroom that was reluctant to use the AI technology that she was bringing into the newsroom. They were concerned about their jobs. And she said to them, she said, look, my number 1, 2, and 3 priorities is to do great journalism, and I'll use every tool available to help me do that. I do not have a priority that's about saving your jobs. You obviously want to save your careers. And if you want to do that, then you need to adapt and adopt the capabilities of this technology so you too can have the superpowers and be better than you are today.
We should have Gina on. Gina does great work at Semaphore. She did a thing where she got a what do you call it? The people you use on Amazon to do tasks, Mechanical Turk.
Mechanical Turk.
So she did a Mechanical Turk, where she used models to look at reports of police brutality, and because they were in all different forms and all different structures, and there was no structure to the data to figure out, she got the models 2 years ago to figure out how to look at all these things and get a better account of what was happening around race and police brutality.
Yeah, we need to have a Palantir for journalists as opposed to a Palantir for government. I think
a Palantir for journalists is a phrase I never thought I'd hear. Listen, I guess I'm not opposed.
This is a secret that exists, but we're not allowed to know.
This is what you were teaching, Jeff, right? Is the journalist as data scientist?
It's a lot of it.
Well, and to your question, I mean, there is actually no facet of the journalistic profession that can't be improved and enhanced by the use of AI. There's none. And some of it is simple things. Does it help you do research? Does it help you ask questions that you might otherwise not be comfortable asking? When I write things today, one of the things I do is feed it into one of the models and say, give me positive and negative criticism of this piece. Help me understand if I'm phrasing it properly. Am I making the argument correctly? But if you take it into the newsroom, I mean, the point about data, for instance, one of the projects at Google that I was most proud of was when we did, or the team in Israel that is still working on this stuff, when we built Pinpoint. This was 5 or 6 years ago, and we were calling it machine learning. It wasn't doing the generative part, but it was all AI, which was how do I analyze, 100,000 documents that I otherwise wouldn't even be able to analyze manually, to understand what's in those documents, to organize them and structure them based on known entities and dates and locations and so on and so forth. Help me find the needles in the haystack. That's even more capable today with Gen AI. So, it can obviously help you do the investigations that you otherwise would not have even attempted. It can help you monitor beats. It can help you monitor sources of streams of data to understand anomalies. We did a project at Google that was trying to look at, could we geofence search queries to detect stories that otherwise we might not understand? And the example for that, because we knew it was true, was the Flint water crisis. If we had looked into search queries, and we did 6-8 months before the water crisis, you saw queries that said, my water smells bad, my water tastes bad. Now you put those signals in front of thoughtful reporters, and they go, oh, maybe there's something we should be digging into on the state of the water supply in Flint. Right? That's powerful stuff. And that's just, these are just 2 examples out of many with regard to the newsroom. So, I think any newsroom that ignores the capabilities of AI is a newsroom that's ignoring its future.
Of course, there's the flip side of that coin. And if I were in the news business, I might worry about it. Oh, I guess I am, aren't I? I am worried about it, which is there increasingly individuals are going to be able to create their own personalized news feeds. And we're already seeing this with tools that like Perplexity that I like to use, which is kind of disintermediating the original source work, taking them out of the equation and giving me the results. I see a future, we talked about this with Nikita Roy, of personalized news. And of individuals doing that. Doesn't that just put more pressure on journalistic organizations? Takes them out of the equation in some cases, except as source materials.
Look,
source materials is very important.
Yeah, but it doesn't pay, right?
Yeah.
It's the most expensive part of the whole thing, and if you're not getting the hits,
that's memory lane.
Several things there. Look, throughout the history of journalism, even before digital and electronic, you would browse an array of sources and titles before you dug in.
Right.
You'd go to the newsstand and browse for a half hour. Maybe you'd buy one magazine. Maybe you'd buy none at all.
Right.
That's an important and ongoing dynamic. Having personalized news feeds, I think, simply helps people get exposed to more stuff. My real issue with the personalized news feeds, and it's inevitable and I can't stop it, is it giving you a siloed view of the reality and not exposing you to things that you should see. Like when I was running Google News, I wanted to make sure that we didn't just have the personalized For You tab, but we had a tab which I wanted to be the default, which was, here is our sense of what news is across the country right now, unpersonalized.
Talk about the early days of Google News, and because the reaction to it, the news industry wasn't sure what to do with it. It was a 20% project for somebody else, but what were the design?
They had the same fears, right? This fear of being, removed from the equation, of Google intermediating.
Yeah, they did, and we can talk about that. But first back to the history of Google News, and that was just a bit before my time with Krishna Bharat. That came out of the shadows of 9/11, right? It was literally in that period after 9/11, and Krishna was one who said, I want to understand how people are looking at this story from around the world, right? How do I do that? And that was really the birth of Google News. How could we take and use algorithms and k-means clustering to identify sources of coverage on a given topic from any place in the world and give me an option to consume those perspectives? And that's a powerful thing, continues to be a powerful thing. I think the challenge with the news industry in this regard has been, just largely self-defeating. Because what I've always said was, and it is absolutely true, is that Google News, Google Search, these are effectively the biggest newsstands on earth that, by the way, publishers don't have to pay to be on, right? So you're putting the content before many more people. You're giving them more options to dig in. And they do dig in, but it is a competitive environment. I think what publishers often don't want to acknowledge about the internet was that it introduced massive competition at every dimension. They no longer controlled their distribution. They no longer controlled the advertising market, where they could basically hold up the 3 local department stores for whatever rates they wanted to ask. And at least as important, consumers had many, many places to go for the information that they used to get from the newspaper. It's simply what I always say is like, the newspaper in Dallas in 1985 was the internet of that community.
Yeah.
Now we have an internet, and it's a news node on the internet. And I don't need to go to the Dallas Morning News to find out where the movies are playing or what the stock quotes are. That's all, we don't do that anymore.
It's clearly a benefit to the consumer of news, especially if you're a smart consumer. How does it benefit the publishers, the creators of the news? Because they're bearing the expense.
It benefits them to the extent that they are truly willing to dig deep and understand the new marketplace and figure out what products can they build that will fit that market, right? To me, one of the unfortunate problems of the legacy news industry in the last 30 years of the internet was somehow not recognizing that their success was going to have to be based on how the new marketplace worked, not their hope that somehow the internet would twist its head around and respect their products for what they were and make sure they were as successful as they always were, right? So it's not like we're not finding successes in publishing in the new environment. We are, but we're finding it from those who are willing to be innovative about finding the place in the market, build products to suit, understand user behaviors enough to present that content to them in the form in which they're willing to accept it.
Give us some examples of people who are doing it right.
Well, I mean, in a certain sense, I'd have to look and say the New York Times is getting it right.
Right.
We can find reason to criticize any outlet out there, but have they been smart about growing that business? They didn't get it immediately, right? They spent 15 years before they did the innovation report. And then they got really thoughtful about how they do it. They're thoughtful about how they drive subscriptions, thoughtful about how they structure their pricing and offers to get those subscribers on board. Mark Thompson will tell you about very interesting steps along that road that he would not have, predicted. But once they kind of really turned to innovation, they started to figure these things out. The company I mentioned in Canada at the local level is stunningly innovative at how they approach being a news outlet. And not only in providing news, but creating opportunities from engagement. They've created now and are rolling out in their markets a local community interest network, basically a very nicely designed Reddit for local. It's not about following people and posting into the bliss, into the morass. It's about following topics that I'm interested in. I'm a woodworker. I like the local music scene with curated hosts. How do I engage with people in my community, both virtually and in the real world? That's powerful, and people like that. But that's innovation. That's recognizing that it's not just producing articles and somehow sticking them somewhere and hoping that enough people read them.
Is there room for more than one? I mean, one of the complaints is that, there's one New York Times. We used to have a daily newspaper in every city. Is there room for more than one?
Is there move for more than one newspaper in a city?
Well, not clearly not. But I mean, is there room for more than one? Maybe a newspaper in the country. It feels like, you could point to the New York Times, but then for every New York Times, there's a dozen failed local newspapers.
Well, yeah, but you're talking.
Is it they're doing it wrong, right? Or is it that there isn't room for them?
No, but you have to. The information marketplace is not a singular dimension. It's many dimensions. Right. The national environment is quite distinct from the local environment, which is quite distinct from vertical environments. But if you look at those individually, obviously the New York Times has been very successful as a national vehicle. Are there room for competition for other national vehicles? Certainly. In fact, we'd probably see more of that if some of them hadn't stumbled of late.
Right.
But there's certainly opportunity there. And the models there, and the other thing I quibble about is people who say we need to experiment with business models. The business models are known, right? At the national level, it's clearly going to be largely driven by subscription. And they're doing that, effectively. What, if they hit 10 million? I think they have, or they're very close to it. So that's very possible. You look at the verticals, I can tell you around the world, there are very successful verticals in everything from politics to various industry sectors. Politics is a particularly lucrative one. Yeah. Look at 24/7 in Brasilia, for instance, or even Village Media's Trillium in Ontario. Those are subscription offers. They have high value content, and it works quite well. I think at the local level there too, it's very different. And there is where I feel, and where Village has proven, that advertising can still work. And it can still work because at the community level, merchants want to be able to drive awareness of what they're doing to the people in the market they serve. And by the way, information at that level, at that community level, advertising at that community level is information.
That's been our experience, not as a local entity, but as a niche entity.
Yeah.
It's very similar, right? And we are able to succeed and survive because of that.
I've been doing some other pro bono work that involved doing a massive study of the news consumption habits in Chicago, local news consumption habits in Chicago. And there are two key learnings in that. One was that people's information needs are proportionate to physical proximity. Meaning I want to know what's going on in my neighborhood far more than I want to know what's going on in the metropolitan area, right? In Chicago, for instance, the only topic of broad metropolitan interest is the Bears, is sports, right? Because otherwise it's all local. And
interesting.
In fact, if you think through that, the metropolitan dailies were the ones that were most vulnerable, because none of them were any longer relevant from us as a source of national news.
Right.
And they weren't local enough to be relevant to the communities within the metropolitan area they served.
Right.
And the last interesting thing in that survey was we asked a question at the end. We said, what motivates you to consume local news? And we gave people a bunch of options they could check. Number one was save money. Right? People want to know where are the deals in the community? Did that new restaurant that open, is that something my family can afford? Right. Number two is health and wellness. Number three was, what's going on in my community? Number four was entertainment. What can I do this weekend? What's going on in the community park? But if you look at it from that level and analyze it from that level, then you can begin to see the opportunities that you otherwise would have ignored if you're following the meme that somehow there's no profitable future in news. Right. I mean, in fact, and I'm sorry to go on here, but the one challenge among the emerging players in the United States is often they were founded by journalists coming out of newsrooms, very noble. What they want to do is the serious accountability journalism, but they don't understand the business. They think philanthropy will support them forever. And as I joke, they would rather eat worms than go to a local merchant and sell an ad.
That's a good point. I like it.
So in your 15 years at Google, I know that it's always been an artificial intelligence machine learning company, but there was a distinguished moment that to the outside world, Google became an AI company, and I always saw a change. What was that like on the inside? When did you see that we're not just a search company, we're not just an ad company, we're going to present ourselves as an AI company?
Well, it was both gradual and sudden. From my perspective anyways, where I sat, it was gradual along the way because we all knew, because Google is a very open and transparent company internally, at least it long has been. So you knew what was going on. You knew the work that Jeff Dean was doing with neural networks and machine learning and so on. And you knew this was something significant and big. And at the product level, again, we were doing things like Pinpoint. We were beginning to apply the technology, and we knew that it was big. But I think the big switch was, as you know, was Google being appropriately cautious given its size and position and the reputation it needed to be protect, was much more cautious about going out with a language model, right? And ChatGPT jumped out there first, even though it wasn't ready for prime time, but nonetheless they did, and they obviously captured a fair amount of imagination, and that's what obviously triggered the next big shift at Google, which was, okay, they've dropped the flag. Now's the time for us to put every effort we can, every dollar we have against becoming an AI company, an AI solutions company.
Because Google had its model.
Yeah.
What was was it shock that OpenAI went out there with something that was rough, or was it a sense of there's a new company and we're already an old one, or what was that reaction like?
I think it was more the first than the latter. I think it was a bit of surprise, but then again, if you thought through it, I remember, when it happened, we were surprised because we had the models and they were testing the models and they knew that there were flaws. I mean, one of the things with language models is, besides the fact that, as you know, it's not just training the language model, it's developing all the necessary grounding that you need to put in place such that the language model is actually coming up with sound answers based on facts and authoritative content, right? A, that takes time. And B, there is no replacement for the big lab in testing. You just can't pose enough queries to know where the flaws are, right? Unfortunately, that only happens when you go out public. So ChatGPT did that. Now, it was also clear to me that, that was obviously a smart move on their part. They could take the risks. And more importantly, they knew that we could not take the risks. So kind of a slick move on their part.
It's a fascinating competitive story that has yet to be fully written, but will be, I'm sure, at some point. So I like your thought that national can be supported by subscription, local by advertising. I think that makes a lot of sense. We're a niche product, also advertising supported, although we're playing with subscriptions as well. And I mean, the information is proven. Wall Street Journal has proven that the subscription model for people who get value out of the content is very viable. People are willing to pay for something that's going to make them money, especially. So there are some models out there. I feel like AI slop is an avalanche that might be difficult to transcend for the few people who are doing it right. Maybe we do still have to get an intelligent news consumer.
Yeah, but at the same time that we're getting AI slop, we're getting increasingly capable AI systems, which can both counter that slop with quality content and can be used to detect and assess the slop that's out there. Sometimes we miss the point that they can use the AI language model to actually assess the AI language model.
Yeah. I think I know at the beginning you said we can't expect consumers to become better news consumers, but I think ultimately that's going to be a source of success for people, is the ability to find a way to get information, especially information outside their own filter bubble, and use it appropriately. And I think there's an opportunity for news there, but it does require kind of a more sophisticated reader. I hope they exist.
And I think, and by the way, I didn't say there was no hope in training consumers to do this. What I said was,
don't count on it.
Because it was rather pointed, was that don't think you can overcome the trust problem by teaching people that they should trust us. Right. I mean, when has it ever been effective for me to say, trust me?
Yeah,
when somebody says, trust me, I actually flip on the other side and say,
you
really?
Why are you saying that?
Yeah, so that's my point.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, what I think is, to me, one of the extraordinary dynamic about language models that I keep coming back to, both in my own behavior and others, is the extraordinary value of non-judgmental learning. Is the fact that I can ask it questions that I would be embarrassed to ask others. One of the bits of research I looked at Google, we had done a lot of the early work on fact checks. And we were assessing, how effective were fact checks in different kind of environments, say a social network versus search. And one of the things that came out of that was on social networks, fact checks are not effective because basically you end up challenging the social construct of the user, right? You put up a fact check next to a post put up by your uncle and basically telling you your uncle was a fool.
Right.
You're going to kind of go into a defensive crouch.
Right.
But with search is a very private experience where you will go to search and ask it a question that you would not ask your spouse. And that's powerful.
Absolutely.
And I think that's true of language models in spades.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's true of all of us. I mean, I learn more faster today with language models than I ever did before because I can do that and I can keep probing. And it's easy to keep probing and easy to learn more. And, does that not have a powerful effect on our younger generations as they come forward?
Yeah.
If we give them any kind of reasonable guidance and make sure that they're actually going to answer engines that, are more likely to be authoritative, then what a wonderful thing. Because they not only get the knowledge, you stimulate them to want more of it.
Paris, you were...
I was going to say, I'm curious what your, daily AI, are there any AI tools that you find yourself going back to or any that are kind of in your weekly routine?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, constantly.
Which ones?
And for very myriad
products
users.
do you like?
I'm primarily using the major ones. I use Gemini primarily. I use ChatGPT sometimes. I use it often just for comparison purposes. I'll do Claude, I'll do ChatGPT, I'll do Gemini just to see if they're particularly different in the answers they give.
But what sort of
these
questions
days,
are you typically asking on just anything?
Those are private, Paris.
Okay, but I'm not asking you to any very specific things. I'm just curious.
I'll give you a couple of various ones. I mean, and again, some of these are completely mundane.
Yeah.
You know, I was reading a book. I'm reading a book called Plato and the Tyrant. You know, about the philosophers and Dionysus and the whole, you know, that area, which sounds terribly intellectual, but it's actually quite interesting and fun. And, you know, and I just wanted to understand, like, how are they writing these things? They had wax tablets and what scrolls existed? What were they on? And, you know, I could go and say, like, well, what were the scrolls in Syracuse that Dionysus was reading from? What were they made of? And I came back and told me papyrus, right? It would have taken me a long time to search for that. That's a simple thing. Two that I found really fun lately, not fun, but really satisfying. One is my youngest daughter just bought a house in Astoria, Queens. And it has a rental unit that they can put out. And I said to Gemini, I said, prepare a manual for me for a first-time New York landlord.
Oh, wow.
And he came back with a wonderful 6-page comprehensive document saying, here are all the things you need to know and look into, right? How powerful is that? Secondly, recently I was in Norway, I had to speak at an event in Norway, and I decided I wanted to spend an extra 3 days renting a car, driving around with drones, because I do a lot of drone stuff, video stuff. And so I went to Gemini. It was a late decision. I said, I'm going to land in Oslo. I have 3 days. I want to stop in Bergen. I want to end up in Lillehammer. Please give me options for scenic drives. Give me 2 other places where I should spend the night. And by the way, I'm taking my drones. And it came back with just an extraordinarily helpful, detailed plan for me. I did the whole trip plan in about 90 minutes, including booking the hotels.
But you understand that information probably came from a variety of guides like Fodor's, and that those people who generated the information originally have been disenfranchised.
Well, yes and no. It is obviously learning from the collective knowledge that's been expressed out there. Fair enough.
We went through that when we put up Condé Nast Traveler online in 1997, where we were trying to cannibalize ourselves because others were going to.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are all kinds of interesting topics out of just that, right?
No, and as a consumer of information, this is a paradise, right? And this is, in fact, Google's mission to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. There is no better way to do it than these chat bots. It's been amazing. But I just worry about the people who create the information and what do they do? And I guess that's what we've been talking about is, as a consumer of information, I'm in heaven.
But now you get to hear from the restaurants,
for consumers who actually live there, to consider where that information came from, so that we don't run out.
Sorry, I didn't mean to stop over you. But you also can now hear from 20 people who live in Lillehammer.
True.
As opposed to the person who goes through for 2 days.
It's not corporatized. It could very well be from real people. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, and a lot of this stuff, as it's collecting knowledge, it's not like, it's only going to Fodor's at all.
But that just means it's the cult of the amateur now, right? That it's right? No, because no professionals will do it anymore because there's no money in it.
Well, I don't know if that's true. I think it depends. And I think also in some of those areas, they obviously are putting in references to where this came from. You can click and go deeper and go to Rick Steves and so on and so forth. Right. Are we going to see winnowing of the publishing environment in certain areas? Certainly. But I'd also have to point out that the web has become a classic tragedy of the commons.
Right.
I mean, my kind of favorite example today is recipe queries. Right. You do a recipe query. I just want to find out, give me the recipe for cornbread. And I got a bunch of recipe sites that insist on giving me the history of the knife and the fork in corn and how the corn was ground. And, you know,
And the
2
author's
miles
personal
later,
relationship with corn.
precisely. You know, and the list of the ingredients is like a mile down after.
Well, that's because the
Well-
recipes become commoditized.
I
and
will
the only
say
way to
that's also
monetize is now
Google's
to.
fault in the sense that those places are optimizing for Google to
That's exactly
rank
right.
higher in the Google search results. But I suppose now they'll be optimizing to be included in an AI search
It's
return.
not. Well, you're right and you're wrong. I mean, you say it's Google's fault. What they're playing off of was their recognition that Google, in assessing the quality of a site, values time on site. And that's why they're doing that, right? It gives them time on site. And by the way, it gives them a whole lot more real estate to show ads.
Or ads, yep.
All right. Now, of course, Google isn't stupid either, right? Because we'll come up with other more detailed metrics that kind of give us a sense of abandonment. And in the recipe category, you'd probably get to know the math that says, all of these people are going to suffer a mile-long scroll. And as soon as they get a half mile down, we're going to recognize that's not really good time on site at all.
Right. No, and that's why I use a recipe tool to extract the recipe so I don't have to read the prose. And I no longer see any of it. Final question, because we got to
be though on recipes, if I might. Where might we be 2 years from now? You know, yes, I'll get the pound cake recipe right up at top. You'll see a winnowing, so there are far less of these, you know, nonsense sites just looking to scam off the internet. But if I do want, you know, other variations on the pound cake recipe, those results will be there, and hopefully they'll be the remaining sites that actually have built loyal audiences.
Well, in fact, for my sourdough recipes, I found a site that I've really found to trust, and they have a subscription, and I'm subscribed to it. So it is. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. There is an option.
You're subscribing to a sourdough recipe
site. The perfect loaf. It's very good.
So it has other bread.
Many
recipes other than sourdough.
But they're mostly sourdough.
But where you found your bagel recipe?
Yes, as a matter of fact. And so it was worth it. So one of the things that has come up, and of course you've got New York Times suing OpenAI, you've got Disney now suing Midjourney, and we've talked about this, is it seems likely that their real end game in all of this is to get licensing fees. Where do you stand on the idea of AI licensing news and information?
Well, so first of all, you know, I thought the results of the Anthropic suit, which came out yesterday, were quite smart and what I had hoped would occur.
Yeah, the judge basically said it's okay. It's reading books. You have the right to read.
As long as you acquire them properly, then it's fair use.
That's right. It's fair use.
It wasn't legal to store them, but it was legal to read.
It wasn't legal to take them when they weren't bought.
Pirated, right?
Yeah. It wasn't about storage. It was the fact that they were pirated.
Right.
But obviously confirmed that we have a right to learn, and the computers we use have a right to learn.
Right.
So, you know, when it comes to copyright, I'm very much in the camp of Thomas Jefferson. You know, Jefferson was the creator of his day, right? Wrote the Declaration of Independence, was a great inventor.
Wrote a Bible without so much God in it. Yes.
Right. And he said that patents and copyright was an insult to an advanced civilization.
Oh, wow.
That he understood within a practical degree, it made sense to reward the creator, but ultimately you needed to reward the society with the knowledge. So, you know, he would roll over in his grave when you look at copyright and patent today and see that on the one hand, drugs get 7 years and authors get life of the author plus 70.
Yeah.
Nothing's going into the public domain. So, you know, we wisely, I hope we won't see copyright change such that we can continue to learn, we can glean the facts for the benefit of everyone. I think the other thing we need to recognize is that all creativity is derivative.
That's right.
We learn from people before us. So I find it kind of amusing when you hear of a well-known, hugely popular millionaire novelist complaining about LLMs learning from his work. And I want to go, well, wait a second. Are you writing checks on a regular basis to the Tolstoy Family Foundation?
Right.
What about your high school English teacher? Right? You didn't come born into this world as a successful novelist. It's derivative. There are what, 9 classic story types that all of you work off of all the time. What means that somehow you get to own one?
Yeah.
So, we need to be smart about copyright. Will there be licensing? To your point, there will be licensing for grounding, but I think it's going to depend very much on the type of content you're talking about. And does it have, does it have particular value because it's not easily found? Does it have particular value because it can be applied to something that will generate further value? So to your point about travel queries as an example, right? Google understands the value of a travel query quite well. And a travel query is worth a whole lot more than a news query. So in coming up with advanced solutions of using AI to satisfy people's travel needs, I can assure you that if there's a need for proprietary content or content from Fedors or content from, those who do mass, aggregation of hotel availabilities and so on, that will get licensed because it makes sense to do so. But in other areas, it will make much less sense to do so. In areas of news, when I look at it from Google's perspective, where we're always being challenged for bias or presumably having an editorial perspective, is, it was always in our best defense to present a diverse array of sources and let the user decide. So I think with LLMs, we would be unwise to give fulsome, detailed answers without noting the various perspectives that are coming from others.
It reassures people too. It adds to trust. Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I always believe that, to me, journalism is giving people the information they need to be informed citizens. I always felt that our role at Google was to give people the tools and point them to the sources of information such that they could be informed citizens, and do that in an assiduously apolitical fashion, which is the way it has to be done. So, I think, frankly, a lot of the focus on AI in those regards has to be like, how do we hone impartial language? I think news organizations should be thinking about that as well. But I don't want to divert from the licensing point. My last point on the licensing is when I talk to publishers, particularly news publishers, as I go say, yeah, there may be licensing, but if you think that there's a golden pot of cash at the end of the LLM rainbow, then you're wrong.
Really?
Because first of all, the news content doesn't have much commercial value. We're in an extremely competitive environment with multiple answer engines, and I can assure you the margins are not going to be found in the category of news.
Interesting. Richard, it's been such a pleasure. We've overstayed our welcome, but I thank you for giving us some extra time. Richard Gingras, you're not retired. Shouldn't use the word retired. Former Emeritus Vice President of News at Google. Very good. I'd love to have you back soon. I really appreciate your thoughts. And I think the balance is fantastic because I think on the one hand, we all as users of news have a lot to gain, but we don't want to put news out of business either because that's important too. So there's got to be some balanced way of doing it.
I very much appreciate that. And, as I said, I'm not done because obviously we've got some significant challenges in front of us, but I do see solutions. I do see constructive paths.
Good.
And I'm eager and willing to work with anyone, frankly, who recognizes that. But we just have to stop pointing fingers and say, everything would be like, oh, if social networks didn't exist, we wouldn't have the political problems we have today. That's a misreading of our world and of the nature of media.
And of the nature of human beings. I agree 100%. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Really appreciate your time.
See you around.
Great to see you again. Thank you. Hey, it's Leo Laporte. I hope you've enjoyed this little clip from our programming at twit.tv. For more, visit our website, twit.tv, or subscribe in your favorite podcast client. There's also a link somewhere down there.